Welcome to the Inspiring Tech Leaders podcast with me, Dave Roberts. Today I'm going to look at vibe tooling and compare GitHub Copilot, Replit, Cursor, and Lovable. The idea of vibe tooling is simple. Instead of sitting down and writing thousands of lines of code yourself, you describe what you want to build and an AI system works out how to build it. It can write the code, create the files, connect databases, run tests, identify errors, make changes, and increasingly deploy the finished application. And there are now several serious players competing for this space. They all use AI to help us build software, but they approach the problem from very different directions. And that distinction is becoming increasingly important because the question is no longer simply which AI coding assistant is best. The much more interesting question is, what kind of software builder are you, and what sort of relationship do you want to have with the AI? Let's start with the term vibe coding. The phrase became popular because it captured a very different way of creating software. You have an idea, you describe it in natural language, the AI generates the code, you look at what has been produced, tell it what you want changed, and continue iterating. You might say, build me a custom portal, add authentication, give it a dashboard, connect it to a database, add a search function, make the interface look modern, and add in an administration area. Historically, that would have been a significant software development project, but with today's tools, it's becoming a conversation, and that is the important change. We are moving from writing software to directing software. The human increasingly becomes the person who defines the problem, describes the desired outcome, makes decisions, and judges whether the result is good enough. The AI is increasingly becoming the implementation engine, but there is a big catch. The various different platforms don't give you the same experience, and I think the easiest way to understand them is to imagine them as four different people building the same application. Imagine you want to build a simple business application. It has a web interface, users need to log in, there's a database, there is an administration dashboard, and there are a few integrations with external services. If I give that requirement to Lovable, I'm essentially saying, here is the product I want, build it. Lovable is particularly focused on taking an idea expressed in natural language and turning it into a working full-stack application. Its current approach can handle the front-end, back-end authentication, database, and integrations, and its agent can plan more complicated tasks, work through multiple steps, and test the application. That makes Lovable perhaps the clearest expression of what many people mean when they talk about vibe coding. You don't necessarily start by thinking about the technology stack. You start with the product. You might say, I want a dashboard for a sales team. It needs a login screen, a customer list, sales chart, and an area where managers can see performance. And Lovable starts turning that description into an application. The appeal is obvious. If you're a founder, product manager, designer, business analyst, or technically curious person who doesn't necessarily want to spend hours working through configuration files, frameworks, and dependencies, this is incredibly powerful. You can concentrate on what you want the application to do rather than exactly how the application should be constructed. And Lovable has pushed this further during 2026. Its autonomous capabilities allow it to take larger pieces of work, plan them, and continue working without requiring you to micromanage every step. There is another interesting development here as well. Lovable has introduced ways for applications created on the platform to work with AI tools such as ChatGPT and Claude through MCP. So we're beginning to see a world where AI simply isn't helping us build applications. AI can also become a way for users to interact with those applications. That is quite a significant shift. Now let's move to Replit. Replit takes a slightly different approach. It is still very accessible and very focused on describing what you want and allowing an agent to build it, but it gives you more visibility into the underlying development environment. Replit's current agent can build applications from natural language, and the platform combines development, execution, and deployment in one environment. Its Agent 4 release in 2026 emphasizes autonomous work, parallel agents, and the ability to deal with things such as authentication, databases, back-end functionality, and front-end design. So if Lovable feels like you're saying, build me an application, Replit feels more like saying, build me an application, but let me look under the bonnet. That distinction matters. Replit can be an excellent bridge between the traditional developer and the non-developer. You can start with a natural language prompt, get an application running very quickly, and then start exploring the code. You can see what the AI has actually created. You can experiment, you can run it and change it as needed, and perhaps most importantly, you can learn from it. That makes Replit particularly interesting for people who want the speed of vibe coding without completely abandoning their traditional software development experience. Imagine someone who has an idea for an application. They may not know Python or JavaScript. They may not understand databases. They may not know what an API is, but they can describe their idea. The AI creates something. They see it working. They start asking questions. What does this file do? Why have you created this database? What happens if I change this? That is a completely different way of learning software development. Instead of learning syntax first and building something later, you can build something first and then learn the underlying technology as you go. And that's why I think Replit sits somewhere between vibe coding and traditional development. Now we come to Cursor. Cursor is probably the tool in this comparison that is closest to the traditional professional software developer. Cursor is an AI-powered development environment built around the idea that AI should understand your existing codebase and become an agent capable of making substantial changes across it. Cursor describes itself as a coding agent for building ambitious software, and its current platform supports autonomous agents, codebase understanding, multiple models, cloud agents, and parallel development. And this is an important distinction. Cursor doesn't primarily say, give me an idea and I'll create your application from scratch. It says, give me your software and let me help you develop it. Of course, Cursor can absolutely build new applications, but its real strength becomes apparent when you already have a serious code base. You might have millions of lines of code. You might have a complex React application. You might have a Python backend. You might have hundreds of tests. You might also have authentication, APIs, databases, and deployment pipelines. And you can ask Cursor to understand that environment and then make a significant change. For example, you could say, add multi-factor authentication to the application, update the login flow, modify the database schema, update the tests and make sure the existing authentication behavior isn't broken. This is a very different proposition from simply generating a landing page. Cursor has already been pushing heavily into autonomous agents. Its cloud agents can operate in isolated environments, make changes, test the software, and produce artifacts such as screenshots, videos, and logs so that a developer can review what happened. And this is where the term vibe tooling becomes useful, because the human is no longer necessarily sitting there watching the AI type. You can give an agent a task, it can go away and work on that task and then come back with the results. You review the changes and decide whether to accept them. Cursor has been moving towards fleets of agents working in parallel, where different agents can work on different pieces of the codebase. That begins to look less like an AI autocomplete tool and more like an AI software engineering team. Now let's talk about GitHub Copilot. This is where the comparison becomes particularly interesting because GitHub Copilot has evolved enormously from the product many people originally knew. The old model of GitHub Copilot was essentially an AI pair programmer. You start typing the code and it suggests the next piece of code. You accept it and continue. That is still part of GitHub Copilot, but is no longer the whole story. GitHub now has Copilot agent mode inside development environments where the agent can determine which files need to be changed, execute commands, iterate and remediate problems. And then there is GitHub Copilot Cloud Agent. This is where GitHub's strategy becomes particularly powerful. You can give GitHub Copilot a task and let it work in the background in its own development environment. It can investigate the repository, make changes, run tests, and ultimately produce a pull request or leave the work on a branch for you to review. So imagine you have a GitHub repository with an issue saying improve the search experience. Previously, a developer would read this issue, investigate the code, make changes, run tests, and create the pull request. Now you can increasingly assign that task to an agent. The agent investigates, plans, writes code, and tests. The human then reviews. That is a fundamental change in the software development workflow. GitHub has also added things such as model selection, self-review, security scanning, custom agents, and CLI handoff to its coding agent experience. And this brings us to what I think is the most important difference between the four tools. Lovable is extremely focused on turning an idea into an application. Replit is focused on making that process accessible while keeping the development environment visible. Cursor is focused on making an existing codebase highly agentic. GitHub Copilot is increasingly focused on putting AI agents directly into the software development lifecycle and GitHub workflow. So which one is best? Well, the answer is it depends. For example, if I'm a non-technical founder and I have an idea for a SaaS product, I would probably start by looking at Lovable. I don't necessarily want to understand the architecture on day one. I want to see the product, experiment, and then have the ability to say, that's not quite right, change this, add that, or remove this. That's where Lovable becomes extremely compelling. If I want more visibility into the code and the development environment, Replit becomes very attractive. It's a great middle ground. It allows you to move more quickly while still giving you access to the underlying machinery. If I'm a professional developer working on an existing software product, Cursor becomes extremely compelling. The ability to understand a codebase, work across multiple files, use different models, and delegate substantial engineering tasks is very powerful. And if my organization is already heavily invested in GitHub, GitHub Actions, pull requests, issues, security controls, and enterprise deployment processes, GitHub Copilot has a huge advantage. It isn't just an AI coding tool, it sits in the software development ecosystem, and that matters. Because enterprise software development isn't simply about generating code. It's about governance, security, identity, source control, code review, testing, auditability, and deployment. It's about understanding who changed what, why they changed it, and whether that change is safe. This is one of the reasons I think the enterprise battle around AI coding is going to be particularly fascinating. The winner won't necessarily be the tool that writes the best piece of code. It could be the platform that creates the best overall development system. And that brings us to one of the dangers of vibe coding. Just because an AI can build something doesn't mean the thing it is built is good. This is probably the biggest misconception surrounding the whole movement. You can ask an AI to build an application. It might work, it might look fantastic, it might even have thousands of lines of code behind it. But does it have a sensible architecture? Is it secure? Does it handle edge cases? Are permissions correctly implemented? Is the database designed properly? Can it scale? Does it leak sensitive information? Are dependencies maintained? Does the application have appropriate tests? And perhaps most importantly, does anyone actually understand what has been built? The easier software becomes to create, the easier it becomes to create bad software. And that is the paradox. AI can dramatically reduce the cost of creating software, but it can also dramatically reduce the cost of creating software that nobody understands. That is why I don't think the future is simply non-developers replacing developers. I think the future is developers becoming dramatically more productive while non-developers gain the ability to create software that previously required a development team. Those are two different things. And there is another shift taking place. We used to think of software development as a linear process. A product manager writes a specification, a designer creates the interface, a developer writes the code, a tester tests it, an operations team deploys it. AI is beginning to collapse those boundaries. One person can describe an idea, an agent can generate the interface, another agent can create the backend, another can write tests, another can investigate security, another can review the code, and the human becomes the orchestrator. That is what I mean by vibe tooling. It's not just vibe coding. It is an idea that natural language becomes a control layer across the entire software development process. And that raises a really interesting question. What happens to the skill of programming? I don't think programmers disappear, but I think the value changes. Knowing how to write a loop is useful. Knowing how to design a secure system is much more valuable. Likewise, knowing syntax is useful, but knowing what architecture you should use is much more valuable. The AI can generate an enormous amount of implementation, but someone still has to decide whether that implementation is appropriate. That means critical thinking becomes more important, not less. Architecture thinking, security, and testing all become more important, and the ability to communicate clearly with machines becomes a genuine technical skill. Because prompting is evolving. The early version of vibe coding was often just build me a website. That works for a demonstration. It doesn't work particularly well for a complex production system. The better approach is to describe the objective, the constraints, the users, the business rules, the architecture, the acceptance criteria, and the tests. In other words, the better you understand the problem, the better you can direct the AI. And perhaps that is the biggest lesson from comparing these four platforms. The AI isn't eliminating the need for experience, it's changing where experience matters. So if we look ahead, I think the distinction between these products will gradually become less clear. Lovable is becoming more developer-friendly, Replit is becoming more autonomous, Cursor will become more accessible to non-developers, GitHub Copilot will become more agentic, and all of them will increasingly use multiple models rather than relying on a single underlying AI model. That is another fascinating part of this competition. The real differentiator may not be the model, it may be the agent harness around the model, the tools the agent can use, the context it can access, the quality of the code base understanding, the ability to test its own work, the ability to maybe recover from errors, the security controls, the workflow around human approval, and the integration with the rest of the technology ecosystem. In other words, the future isn't necessarily about having the smartest AI, it's about giving the AI the right environment in which to work. And that takes us back to the four platforms. Lovable feels like an AI product builder, Replit feels like an AI development environment, Cursor feels like an AI software engineer sitting inside your code base, and GitHub Copilot increasingly feels like an AI layer sitting across the software development lifecycle. None of them are universally better, they simply optimize for different starting points. And if I had to give one piece of advice to anyone experimenting with these tools, it would be this. Don't start by asking which tool is best. Start by asking, what are you trying to build? If you are validating an idea, use the tools that get you from idea to prototype the fastest. If you're learning, choose something that lets you see and understand what the AI is doing. If you're maintaining a code base, choose a tool that understands your repository and development workflow. And if you're running software development at enterprise scale, look beyond coding experience. Examine governance, security, integration, and control. Because the most important thing about vibe tooling isn't that AI can write code. We've known that for a while. The really important development is that AI is beginning to take responsibility for much larger parts of the software development process. We're moving from autocomplete to agents, from agents to autonomous workflows, and potentially from individual AI assistants to teams of AI agents working alongside human teams. That doesn't mean the developer disappears. It means the definition of a developer changes. The developer of the future may spend less time writing lines of code and more time deciding on what should be built, how it should be built, whether it is safe, whether it is maintainable, and whether it actually solves the problem. And perhaps that is the real promise of vibe tooling. Not that we stop building software, but we can spend more time thinking about what the software can actually do. However, I suspect we're going to look back at 2026 as an early chapter in this story, because the real transformation isn't going to be about which AI coding tool wins. It's going to be about what happens when creating software becomes conversational. When the interface to your development environment isn't primarily a keyboard and an IDE, it's a conversation. You describe the outcome, the AI figures out the implementation, you review it and refine it, and eventually, perhaps, you simply say what you want the software to become. That is the world of vibe tooling, and it could fundamentally change who gets to build software, how software is built, and ultimately how quickly ideas can become reality. Well, that's all for today. Thanks for tuning into the Inspiring Tech Leaders podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your network. You can find more insights, show notes, and resources at www.inspiringtechleaders.com. Head over to the social media channels. You can find Inspiring Tech Leaders on X, Instagram, Inspo, and TikTok. And let me know your thoughts on vibe tooling. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay curious, stay connected, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible in tech.